Hi there and welcome to the channel of A Disappointed Man with me, Jason Kennedy, the Disappointed Man. And in this video I'll be talking about this book, Selected Short Stories by Guy de Maupassant. Now, for my French-speaking viewers, of whom there are several, no introduction may be necessary for Maupassant, but for the rest of us, some biographical information may prove useful. So let's begin with that. Maupassant was born in 1850 in Normandy, and it's Normandy that provides the setting for many of his stories. If you're not familiar with the French landscape or its towns, I suggest searching for some of these place names and seeing just how beautiful the locations he chooses for his tales are. The one I'll show you here, I'll try and pronounce it. I think it's Étretat. Yes, sorry about that. And as he became more famous, he used his money to go traveling, and he would use material collected from these travels in subsequent volumes of short stories. So that helped again to broaden his work considerably. He did suffer from syphilis, and this is the reason he died at such a tender age. Mental illness set in as a result. He had a suicide attempt and was then committed to an asylum and died there a year or so later. Now, before getting into the stories themselves, I want to include a brief diversion here, because one thing that is very interesting is Maupassant was very popular in England during his lifetime, and there are many references in writings by English authors to him and his works, and I just want to provide one from a book by E.F. Benson, and it's called Blaize, and it's a Bildungsroman set in an English public school. And this passage is about a teacher, a master at the school, surreptitiously enjoying one of Maupassant's yellow books while he should be attending to the boys or to some paperwork, and it goes like this. Having told Blaize to get on with his home letter, Mr. Dutton resumed his employment, which was not what it seemed. On his desk, it is true, was a large prayer book, for he had been hearing the boys their catechism, in the matter of which Blaize had proved himself wonderfully ignorant, and had been condemned to write out his duty towards his neighbour 3 times, and show it up before morning school on Monday. There was a Bible there also, out of which, when the Sunday letters home were finished, Mr. Dutton would read a chapter about the second missionary journey of St. Paul, and then ask questions. But while these letters were being written, Mr. Dutton was not sabbatically employed, for nestling between his books was a yellow-backed volume of stories by Guy de Maupassant. Mr. Dutton found him most entertaining. He skated on such very thin ice, and never quite went through. Mr. Dutton turned the page. Yes, how clever not to go through, for there was certainly mud underneath. He gave a faint chuckle of interest, and dexterously turned the chuckle into a cough. At that sound, a small sigh of relief. A sense of relaxation went round the class, for it was clear that old Dutton was deep in his yellow book. When that consummation, so devoutly wished, was arrived at, any diversion of a moderately quiet nature might be indulged in. Not only is that passage very amusing, but I think it's quite penetrating too, in terms of the difference between what French writers at that time were able to include in their material and what English writers would be allowed to write about. Because reading this in 2023, they are still, many of these tales, rather scandalous. 3 of them center upon prostitutes, and they lack any kind of moral judgment of these women. In fact, they rather celebrate them. There's a long story at the end called Madame Tellier's Establishment, where a madame closes her house and takes all of the girls off with her to her home village because it's the first communion of her goddaughter, and all of the prostitutes file into church for the service. It's an amazingly touching and amusing story. You can't really imagine an English writer of the time coming up with such a theme. There's also Boule de Suif, which was the first short story Maupassant had published, and which turned him, rather like Byron, into an overnight famous writer. And that centers upon a prostitute again being placed under pressure to sleep with a Prussian officer in order for her party to be allowed to leave the town that he controls. And then there's one last one called His Confession, and I can't say too much without spoiling it. So there you have it, some rather racy, scandalous material here. But let's talk about some of the other stories here too. Now, there were two other stories in here which really impressed me. First of them was The Olive Grove, which is extremely tense and develops this very oppressive atmosphere, seemingly without any real effort on the part of Maupassant. He's such a skilled writer. The pacing is beautiful. All the two men in the story are really doing is talking and eating and drinking wine, but you just feel the pressure building in this very satisfying way towards an extraordinary climax. In some respects, it reminded me of D.H. Lawrence's wonderful short story, The Prussian Officer, so I greatly enjoyed that. Then there was another called Two Friends, and this one really had me ruminating afterwards. It was extremely moving, actually. Like many of Maupassant's stories, it's set during the Franco-Prussian War, in which he took part, and he reviled war. There are many anti-war stories in this selection, but this one concerns two friends who meet in the street after many years of separation and recall their happy days as young men spent fishing. And so they agree to rush home, get their fishing gear, and try and make their way through the French lines back to the very spot where they spent all those happy hours together and have a day's fishing. Unfortunately, a tragedy unfolds, but this story is just so complex, even though it's rather short, and the mixture of the emotions that it awakened in me was really something very special. Again, it was a tribute to Maupassant's art. So both of those stories were brilliant. I'd highly recommend them. The remainder of the stories were all very short. None of them were more than 10 pages or so, and they cover a diverse range of subject matter, and there are also many of them very amusing. It has to be said, Maupassant is a very funny and inventive writer, but what I found really interesting is how unified they are in terms of their style. Despite the diversity of theme, you can always feel that these tales flowed from the same pen, and that is why I'd like to just speak briefly about Maupassant's style. All of these stories are written in a very concise way, and Maupassant uses types. So he'll have a type of person and then begin providing just sufficient detail to bring that character to life as an individual. And the language itself is not very flowery. I can't extract a passage from one of these stories and read it to you and make you think, wow, that's a great writer. They work as organic wholes from the first sentence to the last. They are brilliantly constructed, and despite the simplicity of the syntax, they are very, very subtle at their finest. And so that's what I would say with regards to the style. So there you have it, one of the greatest exponents of the short story form I've yet to happen across. It's amazing that I've reached almost 50 years of age without reading any of his stories. I feel rather shamefaced about that. You, viewer, if you are younger than me, can get a head start by going and finding them. They're all open source. Choose one, read it, and see whether your opinion coincides with mine. And there, I think I've said enough, haven't I? I'll be keeping these videos rather brief until I feel better, but for now, I will say my farewell. Be safe, be strong, and until the next time, Nanu Nanu.